What if I told you that the trade relationship that once defined global economic stability is now unraveling, with repercussions that could impact your grocery bills, tech gadgets, and even your job? China, America's largest trade partner for years, has slashed $690 billion in imports from the US, sending shockwaves through global markets and signaling a seismic shift in economic dynamics between the two superpowers. This decision, rooted in a combination of geopolitical tensions, trade disputes, and China's growing push for economic independence, marks a critical moment in US-China relations. For years, the two nations have been deeply intertwined, with China serving as a top consumer of US agricultural products, energy resources, and technology. However, as the trade war intensifies and both countries vie for dominance on the world stage, this move highlights an escalating rift with far-reaching implications for industries, workers, and governments worldwide. But why has China turned its back on the US? Is this the end of American dominance in global trade? And what happens when the ripple effects reach your front door? The US is losing its largest customer as China slashes purchases of crops, chips, and LNG. Once America's largest buyer, China has turned to Brazil, Russia, and Europe, threatening the $575 billion trade relationship. The United States and China account for over 40% of global GDP, making their trade relationship one of the most critical in the world. In 2022, bilateral trade between the two nations hit $690 billion, with China serving as a key buyer of American agricultural goods, semiconductors, and energy resources. But here's the existential problem. China's imports of US goods have been declining steadily since 2018. According to the US Census Bureau, Chinese imports of US products dropped by 17.7% in 2023 compared to pre-trade war levels. This is devastating for sectors like agriculture, where China once purchased nearly 60% of America's soybean exports. Dr. Chad, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, warns that this isn't just about trade figures. It's about how deeply interconnected industries are. Losing China as a buyer sends shockwaves through supply chains, employment, and innovation. This economic unraveling can be traced back to the US-China trade war, which began in 2018. The Trump administration imposed tariffs on $360 billion worth of Chinese goods, and Beijing retaliated with tariffs on $110 billion worth of US exports. Agriculture, technology, and energy were among the hardest hit sectors. A report by the National Bureau of Economic Research found that during the trade war's peak, US exports to China fell by nearly 20%. But Beijing didn't just retaliate, it restructured. The Chinese government started diversifying its supply chains, turning to Brazil for soybeans, Europe for technology partnerships, and Russia for energy. In an op-ed for the Financial Times, economist Yun Ding stated that the trade war accelerated China's push for self-reliance. This wasn't a temporary response, it's a long-term strategy. The idea behind tariffs was to pressure China into buying more US goods, but instead, they made American products more expensive and less competitive in global markets. For instance, soybeans, one of the largest US exports to China, saw a price drop of over 18% in 2018 because Chinese buyers pivoted to Brazil. The American Farm Bureau reported that between 2018 and 2020, US farmers lost an estimated $4 billion in export revenue due to tariffs. Tariffs acted as a tax on US businesses and consumers, explained Mary Lovely, a trade economist at Syracuse University. Instead of incentivizing trade, they disrupted supply chains and forced China to look elsewhere. Agriculture has been the hardest hit sector in this economic downturn, largely because of its reliance on China as a key buyer. In 2022, China purchased over $36 billion worth of US agricultural products, down from $45 billion in 2017. Soybeans, corn, and pork were among the most affected commodities. the share of China's soybean imports from the US, its top American export, has dropped 18% in 2024. From 40% in 2016, according to Chinese customs data, China's agricultural imports from the US declined to $34 billion in 2023 from $43 billion in 2022 and are expected to drop further this year. For farmers in the Midwest, this decline has been catastrophic. Farm bankruptcies in states like Iowa and Nebraska increased by 23% during the peak of the trade wars, according to the American Farm Bureau Federation. Many family-owned farms, already operating on thin margins, were forced to shut down. John Heisdorfer, an Iowa soybean farmer and former president of the American Soybean Association, described the situation as dire. Losing China as a customer isn't just a loss of revenue, it's a loss of stability. It's hard to plan for the future when your largest buyer disappears. Export markets take years to build. If you completely lose that market, it will take a decade to come back and replace it with somebody else. Brazil stepped into the gap left by US farmers with strategic precision. In 2022, Brazil exported a record 87.6 million metric tons of soybeans to China, capturing over half of the market share. This dominance wasn't accidental. Brazil benefits from lower production costs, favorable trade agreements, and a currency advantage. Moreover, China has invested heavily in Brazilian infrastructure, including railways and ports, to streamline the transport of agricultural goods. China and Brazil have developed a symbiotic relationship, noted Marcelo Vieira, president of the Brazilian Agribusiness Association. Brazil provides the raw materials, and China provides the capital to move them. The economic fallout from reduced agricultural exports goes far beyond the farms. Entire rural communities depend on the success of agriculture, from equipment manufacturers to logistics companies. When farms lose income, so do the businesses that serve them. A University of Illinois study found that every $1 lost in farm income results in a 2.87 reduction in local economic activity. For rural towns in the Midwest, this means fewer jobs, school closures, and declining populations. This is a death spiral for some communities, warned Megan Nelson, an economist at the American Farm Bureau Federation. Without a robust farming economy, the social fabric of rural America is at risk. China's efforts to reduce reliance on US farm imports are part of a broader strategy to bolster its food security. Key moves include halting purchases of US agricultural products, diversifying supply chains, and developing domestic production capabilities. For example, on August 5, 2019, China halted purchases of US agricultural products in retaliation against tariffs imposed by the Trump administration. By 2023, China had approved several genetically modified crops to boost domestic yields and implemented its first food security law aimed at achieving absolute self-sufficiency in staple grains. These policies have placed China in a better position to withstand potential future tariffs on Chinese imports, raising the prospect of further retaliation targeting US agricultural goods. The semiconductor industry, often referred to as the new oil, has also been significantly impacted by the trade war. Semiconductors are the foundation of modern technologies, from smartphones to artificial intelligence. China is aggressively working to close the gap in semiconductor production, marking a significant escalation in the technological Cold War. In 2023, US chip exports to China fell by 14%, according to the Semiconductor Industry Association. This drop is not merely economic, but strategic. China's Made in China 2025 initiative aims to produce 70% of its semiconductors domestically by 2025. To achieve this, China has invested billions into research, development, and manufacturing capabilities. Dan Wang, a technology analyst at Gavekal Research, explained, China views its dependence on foreign semiconductors as a vulnerability. This shift threatens the survival of US tech companies, which have already reported revenue losses due to reduced Chinese demand. For instance, Qualcomm saw its China revenue fall by over 15% in 2023. while US export restrictions on advanced chip technologies aim to curb China's progress, they also incentivize Beijing to accelerate domestic innovation. Scott Kennedy, a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, noted that export controls are a double-edged sword. They may give US companies a short-term advantage, but also force China to double down on technological independence. Energy is another critical area in which China has reduced its reliance on the United States. In 2021, the US was a leading supplier of liquefied natural gas, LNG, to China. By 2023, those exports had declined by 25%, according to the US Energy Information Administration. Following the Russia-Ukraine conflict, China deepened its energy ties with Russia, signing a 30-year agreement for natural gas imports via the Power of Siberia pipeline. Additionally, China secured long-term LNG deals with Qatar, including a $60 billion agreement signed in early 2024. For US energy companies, this decline in Chinese demand represents a significant loss. The Energy Information Administration reported a 22% drop in LNG export revenues in 2023, with ripple effects across the broader energy sector. China's diversification strategy is fundamentally altering global trade dynamics. By reducing its dependence on the United States, Beijing is building stronger ties with emerging markets and regional partners. For instance, China's trade with Brazil surpassed $50 billion in 2023, making Brazil its largest trading partner in South America. Jennifer Hillman, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, warned that the United States risks being sidelined in global trade if it doesn't adapt. China is positioning itself as the center of a new trade order. Trump's tariff war, while intended to punish China, may have unintended consequences for the US, including higher costs for consumers and strained relationships with allies. Higher prices on imported goods could reduce consumer spending, potentially affecting jobs in the retail sector and contributing to inflationary pressures in the US economy. Despite Trump's strong rhetoric, the actual implementation of his proposed tariffs remains to be determined. Some economists speculate that Trump might implement the tariffs gradually to mitigate sudden economic shocks. This could involve starting with lower tariff rates and increasing them over time. Alternatively, Trump may use the threat of tariffs as leverage in negotiations with China, rather than immediately imposing them. This approach aligns with his self-proclaimed deal-making style and could lead to a new trade agreement between the two countries. The potential negative impacts on US consumers and certain industries could lead to domestic opposition to the tariffs, potentially influencing their implementation. Business groups, particularly those reliant on Chinese imports or with significant operations in China, may lobby against the tariffs or seek exemptions. Additionally, the state of the global economy at the time of Trump's re-election could affect the timing and extent of tariff implementation. The trade war between the US and China has become a complex and high-stakes conflict with far-reaching implications for the global economy, geopolitics, and the balance of technological power. As the two superpowers continue to compete for dominance, the outcome remains uncertain, with potential winners and losers on both sides of the Pacific. China's cancellation of soybean contracts with North Dakota exemplifies the fallout. Once a major buyer of American crops, China has now shifted its imports to Brazil and Argentina, leaving the $64 billion US farming industry scrambling to find new markets. For US farmers, the stakes couldn't be higher. Many have voiced concerns about the long-term viability of their operations if trade relations with China continue to deteriorate. John Heisdorfer, an Iowa soybean farmer, summarized the sentiment. "We built these agricultural markets for decades. Your tariff rhetoric serves only to tear those down and provide uncertainty to the market." Meanwhile, China's strategic decisions, such as investing in alternative supply chains and developing domestic self-reliance, suggest that its approach to the trade war is calculated and long-term. Beijing is positioning itself to weather future challenges and emerge stronger in the face of economic decoupling efforts by the US. The US economy is also feeling the pinch. For instance, The agricultural landscape is shrinking. Projections show a reduction of 1.3 to 2.2 million acres in US soybean cultivation, affecting rural communities deeply reliant on farming. Equipment manufacturers like Deere & Company report declining demand.